The radar warning light flashes, and both men know exactly what it means before the tone even starts to scream. A Soviet surface-to-air missile battery, hundreds of kilometers below, has rolled the dice. Somewhere in the darkness under that black curved horizon, a guideline or something nastier has left its rail. Its solid fuel burning white hot, its radar seeker already reaching into the thin air above the Soviet Union for one very specific echo, the echo of a shape that should not exist. The reconnaissance systems officer calls it out anyway by the book: missile launch. The pilot does not brake, does not jink, does not dive. He just moves one gloved hand, calmly, deliberately, and pushes the throttles of both engines slightly, almost imperceptibly, forward. The SR-71 Blackbird begins to run. At Mach 3.2 and 85,000 feet, run is the wrong word and the only word that fits. The aircraft is already moving at more than 2,200 miles per hour, 3 times the speed of sound, 16 miles above the Earth's surface. Above them, the sky is not blue, it is black. Below them, the planet glows faintly, a curved map smeared with the sodium glow of cities and the occasional silent flash of distant storm fronts. Between the missile and the Blackbird, the distance widens second by second. The guidance computer on the missile recalculates, strains, bends its own performance envelope. It is too late. The target has stepped outside the geometry of the shot. The missile dies alone in empty sky. The Blackbird does not even change course. How do you build an airplane that treats a supersonic missile like bad weather? To answer that, you have to start with failure, with a different aircraft, a different day, and a very different ending. May 1st, 1960, a CIA U-2 spy plane flying at 70,000 feet, an altitude the United States believed, wrongly, to be beyond the reach of Soviet defenses, crosses into Soviet airspace. It has done this many times before, photographing missile fields, bomber bases, shipyards, the hidden nervous system of a closed empire. This time, the Soviet Union is ready. An SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile detonates close enough to tear the fragile glider apart, and pilot Francis Gary Powers falls into history, into captivity, and into every newspaper in the world. Wreckage is put on display. So is he. The political fallout is immediate. The embarrassment is total, and the strategic problem is terrifyingly clear. The United States cannot see inside the Soviet Union anymore. And in the early 1960s, spy satellites are primitive, rare, and unreliable. The U-2 is suddenly a dead man flying. It will be seen. It can be shot down. It no longer buys security. It invites catastrophe. So the question lands on the desk of one man in Burbank, California. Clarence Kelly Johnson runs Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, known by everyone who matters as the Skunk Works. He is already a legend. The P-38 Lightning, the U-2, a string of aircraft that pushed performance into places the textbooks said were impossible. Now Washington asks him for something that sounds insane even by his standards. Build an aircraft that flies higher than the U-2, much higher. Build one that flies faster than any fighter in existence, much faster. Build one that can cross an entire country in minutes, photograph targets with surgical precision, and leave before anyone can touch it. How much higher? 8 kilometers higher than any known aircraft. How much faster? 60% faster than the Soviet Union's best fighters. In 1958, that is not a design request. It is a dare. The first answer is the A-12, a single-seat reconnaissance aircraft built in such secrecy that most of the Air Force will not know it exists for years. Out of that comes the SR-71, the 2-seat strategic reconnaissance version that will wear Air Force markings, carry more sensors, and eventually fly 3,151 missions over the most hostile airspace on Earth without losing a single crew member to enemy fire. But to get from idea to aircraft, Johnson's team has to break almost every rule of conventional aviation. At Mach 3, air stops behaving like the invisible, compliant, fluid pilots are used to. It becomes something else. A wall, a blowtorch. At 2,200 miles per hour and 85,000 feet, the friction of air molecules against the aircraft's skin heats the leading edges of the wings and nose to more than 400 degrees Celsius. Aluminum, the metal that built almost every aircraft of the Second World War in the early jet age, begins to soften and lose strength at those temperatures. An aluminum Blackbird would quite literally melt. So they build it from titanium. 90+% of the SR-71's airframe is titanium or titanium alloy, a metal 3 times stronger than steel by weight and capable of surviving the temperatures that Mach 3 flight will inflict on it. The catch is that the United States does not mine titanium in the quantities needed for such a program. The only place on Earth that does, at scale, is the Soviet Union. In one of the Cold War's most perfect ironies, the CIA quietly sets up shell companies to buy Soviet titanium ore, ship it out through third countries, and deliver it to American mills, where it is turned into the skin and ribs of the aircraft that will spy on its supplier. Somewhere in Zaporizhzhia or another Soviet mining site, a crane operator moves ore that will become the leading edge of an aircraft his own air defense system will never catch. Titanium introduces problems of its own. It is brittle, difficult to machine, and unforgiving of error. Tools that work on aluminum shatter on contact with it. New cutting fluids, new machining techniques, new heat treatment processes, all have to be invented just to get from blueprint to parts. And once assembled, the aircraft presents another terrifying problem. On the ground, cold and still, the SR-71 leaks. Panels do not fit flush. Gaps between the titanium plates are obvious. Fuel pours out of seams like water through a cracked bowl. To an unbriefed observer, the Blackbird looks like a catastrophic manufacturing failure. But every gap is deliberate. At Mach 3.2, the entire fuselage and wings of the aircraft will heat soak and expand several inches. The gaps will close. The panels will seal. The aircraft will become what it was designed to be, only at speed. That requires a fuel no one has ever used before. JP7 is closer to lamp oil than to gasoline. Its flash point is so high that a lit match dropped into a bucket of it will go out. It will not vaporize easily and will not explode under the brutal temperatures of the Blackbird's skin. It is so stubbornly stable that ground crews have to use a chemical called triethylborane, which ignites on contact with air just to light the engines. Every time the pilot moves the throttles into afterburner, a small shot of triethylborane detonates in the engine, acting like a spark plug for a fuel that refuses to catch fire under ordinary conditions. Why build an aircraft that needs a special fuel, a special ignition system, special hydraulics, special everything? Because nothing about how it flies is ordinary. 2 Pratt & Whitney J58 engines sit in the cells that look oversized even on this long, predatory fuselage. Each engine produces 32,500 pounds of thrust in afterburner, but at Mach 3.2, the J58 is only half an engine. The other half is the air inlet. At those speeds, the shock cone at the front of each intake, that sharp, pointed spike, moves forward and back under computer control, positioning the shock wave exactly where it needs to be inside the inlet duct to slow the incoming air to subsonic speeds before it hits the compressor face. Done correctly, the intake becomes a ramjet. More than half of the aircraft's thrust at cruise comes not from burning more fuel in the turbine, but from the pressure of air ramming into those carefully sculpted ducts. If the cones are in the wrong place, the airflow unstarts. The carefully balanced column of supersonic and subsonic air collapses. The engine bangs like an explosion. The aircraft yaws violently as one side loses thrust. Pilots describe it as being kicked by a giant. They train to correct it instinctively, to push the throttles, to get the airflow back, to keep the knife edge of physics they are skating on from shredding beneath them. All of this, titanium, JP7, J58s, shock cones, exists for one reason: to carry 2 men and a box of cameras across enemy territory at a speed that makes interception a math problem with no solution. From 80,000 feet, an SR-71 can survey more than 100,000 square miles of Earth's surface per hour. Side-looking radar maps coastlines and missile sites through cloud cover. Optical cameras capture photographs so sharp that objects 6 inches across can be identified on the prints. Signals intelligence receivers record radar emissions, communications, the invisible electronic heartbeat of enemy air defenses. In a single mission, a Blackbird can map a nation. The Soviet Union, North Vietnam, North Korea, and others respond the only way they can. They shoot. Over 3 decades of operations, aviation historians and Air Force data estimate that more than 4,000 surface-to-air missiles are fired at SR-71s, SA-2s, SA-5s, upgraded systems with faster speed, longer reach, smarter seekers. None of them ever bring a Blackbird down. Airman magazine would later note that the SR-71 evaded all 4,000 and remains the only U.S. Air Force aircraft never to lose a crew member to enemy action, in the air or on the ground. How is that possible? Part of the answer is speed and altitude. The SA-2 can reach Mach 3.5 in a climb, faster on paper than the Blackbird. But paper speed is not the whole story. A missile needs time to be cued, its radar to lock on, its guidance loop to settle. In that time at Mach 3, the SR-71 has moved miles downrange. Even a missile with a slight speed advantage cannot make up the geometry if the target is already leaving the engagement envelope before the missile leaves the rail. By the time the warhead reaches the altitude and range where the Blackbird used to be, the Blackbird is somewhere else. Another part of the answer is electronic. The SR-71 carries a sophisticated suite of defensive systems that detect radar emissions, jam guidance signals, and deploy decoys when needed. But pilots and RSOs who flew it will tell you something simpler. If we saw a missile launch, we lit the burners and we left. There is one more, stranger part of the answer: luck. Over North Korea, over Hanoi and Haiphong, over the Baltic, there were moments when Blackbird crews saw every warning light illuminated, heard every tone, and knew that multiple missiles were in the air, tracking them, closing. The math said they should die. The physics said they might not. The universe chose physics. The aircraft's operational record reads like an atlas of Cold War tension. Over Vietnam, it flies straight over Hanoi at a time when other aircraft are being forced into circuitous routes to avoid the densest air defenses in the world. Over the Middle East in 1973, it photographs ceasefire lines and troop movements in real time, giving Washington clarity that neither side's diplomats are providing. Over the Barents Sea and the Baltic, it skirts Soviet airspace, collecting the signatures of their radar systems, the positions of their fleets, the outlines of their northern bastions. No other reconnaissance system on Earth in that era can match its combination of speed, flexibility, and immediacy. Satellites can see, but only when their orbits bring them overhead, along predictable paths the Soviets learned to anticipate. The Blackbird is scheduled when needed, sent where needed, and is gone before anyone can do anything about it. So why retire a machine like that? Cost is the answer given in hearings. Politics is the answer given in hallways. In 1990, with the Soviet Union collapsing, the U.S. Air Force argues that the Blackbird's operating expenses, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, can no longer be justified. Satellite reconnaissance has matured. New programs, new technologies, some still classified, promise to fill the gap. The SR-71 fleet is stood down. Some aircraft go to museums. One goes to the Smithsonian, where it sits in a hangar in Washington, D.C., black and silent, an artifact from a future that never quite arrived. Before it retires, it sets records that still stand. On July 28, 1976, an SR-71 sets an absolute speed record of 2,193,167 miles per hour and an altitude record of 85,068,997 feet. Records for a manned, air-breathing jet that have never been broken. On March 6, 1990, on its final flight to the Smithsonian, another crew flies from Los Angeles to Washington in 64 minutes and 20 seconds, averaging more than 2,100 miles per hour. Airline passengers on the same route barely have time to finish their drinks before looking down and seeing a dark shape crossing the continent below them, outrunning the sunrise. Even after retirement, NASA uses a few Blackbirds as high-speed test beds, pushing them into new experimental envelopes, using them to study high-temperature materials, atmospheric physics, and sonic booms. The aircraft that was born in secrecy and designed for espionage becomes briefly a pure research machine, a flying laboratory at the very edge of what air and metal can do together. And then eventually they all stop. Fuel lines are drained, engines are capped, tires go flat. The titanium, once too hot to touch without gloves, cools to the same temperature as the museum air around it. Visitors walk under the nose and read the plaque. Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet, 2,193 miles per hour, more than 4,000 missiles evaded, 0 lost to enemy action. The numbers land like something between statistics and myth. So what did this machine actually change? It changed what unreachable means. It forced the Soviet Union to divert billions of rubles into air defense systems that might, on a lucky day, with perfect geometry, have a sliver of a chance of hitting it. Money that could not be spent on other weapons, other programs, other wars. It gave American presidents eyes over places where diplomacy had failed, where trust did not exist, where the only reliable information came from lenses the size of dinner plates staring down from the edge of space. It bought time, time to think, time to choose. And it changed something less tangible. It showed what happens when you ask engineers, without irony, to outrun death, and they sit down, pick up their slide rules and say, all right, let's see how far physics can bend before it breaks. Back in that cockpit, with the missile warning light fading and the SA-2 detonating harmlessly a dozen miles behind them, the crew settles back into the rhythm of the mission. They check fuel. They check cameras. They talk softly over the intercom, their voices calm in the cramped, instrument-dominated space of the cockpit, helmets reflecting the pale glow of the gauges. Outside, at 3 times the speed of sound, the air is a screaming, white-hot storm clawing at titanium that came from an enemy mine. Inside, it is routine. This is what routine looked like at the edge of possible. A machine built of stolen metal and invented fuel, flying so high and so fast that the only tactic it ever needed when attacked was the simplest one in the world. Run. The Soviets fired thousands of missiles at it. None ever touched it, because in a sky where everything else was prey or predator, there was one aircraft that refused to play either role. It would not hide. It would not dogfight. It would not jam and dodge and bleed energy in desperate maneuvers. It would do the only thing no one else could. It would leave.